there. Okay, let's continue. In terms of this equilibrium conception of classical and Marxian equilibrium, we may also add the differences between Marx and Schumpeter on accumulation and competition process. Again, they are quite similar, but in Marx, in terms of the equilibrium notion, the idea is based upon the center of gravity, price of production, characterizing long-run equilibrium values, and in the long run, these equilibrium values can be reached. But Marx's analysis, as in the Smithian analysis and also Schumpeterian analysis, competition plays two important roles. One is it creates the tendency for equilibrium in the sense of long-run equilibrium values, but at the same time, competition forces capitalists to decrease their costs by introducing some cost-reducing techniques or technologies, basically. So technology is especially important in Adam Smith and maybe to a lesser extent in Marx as well. So in this regard, again, there's a similarity between Schumpeter and Marx, we can say. But in Schumpeter, especially this creative destruction process, is based upon a non-equilibrium analysis in the sense that the very structure of the system can change and does change within the capital accumulation process, basically. So evolution is basically mechanical in Marx, or it can be seen as an example of punctuated equilibrium, if you stretch to include this notion in Marx's analysis. And in Schumpeter, but the idea is purely evolutionary, I would say. And source of instability is inherently internal to the system in Marx and also Schumpeter. And in Marx, especially crisis theory, presents us with the difficulties in the capital accumulation process, especially. And the creative destruction in Schumpeter, again, creates the problems in the accumulation process, basically. It is also the very force upon which capitalism is based, capitalism dynamism. The dynamism of capitalism actually derives from this creative destruction process in which the entrepreneur is very important in introducing new techniques, basically. So another example from the history of economic thought is, of course, macroeconomic analysis in Keynes. But interestingly, it's, again, I believe, that there are two important visions of Keynes's within the very same book. Sometimes they are not in harmony with each other in the same book. One is, I call it Mark I Keynes, and the Mark II Keynes. In the Mark I Keynes, the analysis is basically a hitchless conception. It's static or comparative static analysis in which temporary or shifting equilibrium notion is employed. So coordination is synchronic and diachronic, in the comparative static analysis. That's why sometimes this kind of conception is called hydraulic Keynesianism. In the 45-degree line Keynesian cross, we have the change of the aggregate demand curve, etc. So basically, order is spontaneous and even stable, and change occurs because of some shifts in functions, shift in the savings function, shifts in the money demand function, shifts in the money supply function, etc., etc. It's functional, linear, and reversible, and the instability is basically money and finance. So this is basically a kind of interpretation of Keynes developed by the Higgs-Hansen framework, I mean the ISLM framework. Sometimes it is called by Mrs. Robinson as bastard Keynesianism because it bastardized Keynes's theory. But I would say that this idea itself can be found in Keynes. So in Keynes's book, there are two opposing approaches are in constant struggle or clash, I would say. The other Mark II interpretation is the hedge fund conception, which is inherently dynamic and it's based upon a kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, so to speak. And these aspects of Keynes's are taken very seriously by the post-Keynesian approaches in economics. And it's dynamic, sometimes random, self-organized, unstable, and dissipative structures may occur. Change may occur in the form of bifurcations. It's adaptive, it's also nonlinear, etc. One of the examples of this approach is, these days it's very fashionable, Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, that is used by many circles to explain financial crises, especially the crisis of 2008. And the source of instability is basically derived from two sources. One is the investment, accumulation, and competition. Other is basically money. Keynes's basic analytical framework is called by himself a monetary production economy, in which money is considered not only as a medium of exchange, but also as a form of wealth, as a financial asset, in other words. So these also creates problems in the determination of employment, not necessarily full employment. Again, there's a tendency for the system to reach an equilibrium, but this equilibrium is not a full employment equilibrium, which may not be stable, etc., etc. So basically, in the different forms of Keynesianism, there are many forms of Keynesianism, in this table that I devise, I present 2, 4, 5. One is there are different names associated with this. The famous ISLM framework, it's also called Grand Neoclassical Keynesian Synthesis of Samuelson, and also Solow, etc. It's also hydraulic, shifting the functions whenever necessary, and also Mrs. Robinson's characterization. They are the same. It's based upon 3 theoretical blocks, I would say: effective demand, money, and investment. Same in Keynes. And in the synthesis interpretation, effective end is synchronic, and quantity constraint models are developed by Robert Clover and Axel Lejon Hoofvoet. Very difficult to say this guy. It means lion head, I guess. So in this model, the quantity constraint models, it's something like this. Households and firms devise some optimal plans, but whenever they go to the market, they come to face with some constraints. For example, I decide to work for a certain period of time, but whenever I go to the market, labor market, I cannot work this much time because there's a constraint in the market. There's unemployment, for example. So my plan will not be fulfilled, basically. So that's the basic idea. And recently, in the 90s and so forth, and these ideas were also employed by important economists, such as the Stiglitz, for example, and also the former central Fed's chair, was he, Bernanke. So in the financial sector, in the banking sector, quantity rations in the credit system, etc. So that's another Keynesian things, because they believe that Keynes's analysis is a kind of disequilibrium analysis because of the existence of this involuntary unemployment. It's not possible to reach full employment equilibrium by necessity. It can happen only by chance because different decision makers, especially households and firms, plans, are not in harmony with each other. You know, what I say is the equality between planned savings and planned investment and so forth. So it's a form of disequilibrium or quantity constraint analysis, they say. And also we have this fundamentalist approach of basically the Paul Davidson, and also there was other guy, Shackle, and these are important, and they actually coined the term post-Keynesian economics. And according to this understanding, in Keynes, the uncertainty, the fact of uncertainty is very important. Uncertainty is the lack of knowledge regarding future, you know. The prices of copper from in 20 years, for example, this is Keynes' own phrase, is not certain. There's no way for us to know these ahead. So that's the basic idea. Whenever there is uncertainty, there will be problems on two grounds. One is the investment. The investment is based upon future expectations. And also money demand is based upon future expectations again. So if we have no idea about the future, and these functions, both the investment function and the money demand function, may be subject to some drastic fluctuations, which makes the equilibrium of the markets, respective markets, to reach, basically. So uncertainty is very important in this interpretation, fundamentalist Keynesianism it's called, and Paul Davidson put forward the term, I forgot again. Anyway, it's the idea that is based upon uncertainty. And also we have these neo-Ricardians, you know, followers of both Keynes and Sraffa. There's this Italian guy, for example. Again, I forgot. I'm getting too old for this stuff. And basically Italians, you know, who love Sraffa. Sraffa was an Italian, as we know, and was a close associate of Keynes's. So it's a kind of mixture of Keynes's and Ricardo's ideas, you know, Sraffa's idea of the general equilibrium framework and debate over distribution theory of the neoclassical economics carries some Keynesian elements also. So also we have this Cambridge approach or Kalekian approach. It is sometimes called Kalecki, sometimes Kaletsky. I have no idea which is the correct one. So Kaletsky is better, I guess. So in this kind of conception, distribution is very important in both the determination of national income and, more importantly, the determination of investment. You know, investment depends on the profit rate, basically, as in the classical or Marxian tradition. Kaletsky was also a Marxist, but there are many important elements in his analysis of investment and capital accumulation that can be seen as a kind of Keynesian. Even Mrs. Robinson was an important follower of both Keynes and Kaletsky. She actually tried to advance a form of growth analysis along Keynesian and Kaleckian lines, basically. So these are different interpretations of Keynesian school. And in some of them are different with respect to their conception of money, you know, as a financial asset. In the synthesis Keynesianism, again, we have this idea, but still in a diachronic or comparative static way, you know, money supply, money demand shifts, this and that. And the term was, by the way, I remember, non-ergodic by Paul Davidson. It means it's not possible, it's impossible to foresee the future. We have no idea about what's going on because nature itself is not uniform. Again, a similar idea, right? but it's more radical in the sense that you cannot foresee the course of evolution, maybe. So it's not possible to predict the future course of events, even in an evolutionary framework. So this is the importance of this fundamentalist approach. Again, quantity constraint models, unfortunately, they are real models. There's no money in those models. In the neo-Ricardian framework, again, we have no money. Only one of the goods in question can be treated as a form of money, which is the medium of exchange only. No money as a financial asset or form of wealth. And also even the Keynes and Cambridge and Keynesian approach, again, we have no money. In the form of investment, investment is very important in both neo-Ricardians and especially Keynesian approach. And in the ISLM framework, investment is used basically as a equilibrating mechanism, so to speak. So in the long run, capital accumulation is not considered as important because, you know, remember Keynes' own phrase that in the long run, we are all dead. Keynesian or macroeconomic analysis is basically a short-run analysis, but it should be augmented, so to speak, with a long-run growth or capital accumulation analysis. So here I use some slides devised by our former professor Gökçe Özgür, so I hope he forgives me. So there's a comparison between Keynesian and Post Keynesian economics here, according to him, and I believe it's true in this regard. So basically, you can see that in the Post Keynesian school, we can say that agents are not rational, no stable equilibrium, and no classical dichotomy between the real sector and the monetary sector. So basically, in the Keynesian tradition, again, we have some important classical and Marxian elements. So Keynes himself, about classical economy, says something like this: classical theories resemble Euclidean geometers in a non-Euclidean world. So that's very important. So this world in a complex and changing and dynamic and evolving world, but we believe that there's no such thing as change or instability or etc., etc. So Euclidean framework. And monetary production is Keynes' space-time. Marriage of conceptual domains previously had to be distinct. So this dichotomy, classical dichotomy, that can be seen in both classical tradition and also in Marx to a great extent, is not existing in Keynes. The basic unit of analysis is the monetary production economy, which is very important to understand capitalism, I believe. So basically, there's a shared hostility towards ISLM, etc., etc. You can see them. And the post-Keynesian economics has important ingredients, the principle of effective demand, and sometimes it is determined by the distribution in the economy, in the macroeconomy. Investment drives savings, not the other way around. So there exists no automatic or even minimally reliable mechanisms that will eliminate excess capacity and involuntary unemployment. Interest rates depends on monetary concentration, not on the so-called real forces of productivity and thrift. There's no natural rate of interest to equilibrate investment and savings. So these are all elements of instability. Potentially, they create instabilities and unstable growth and accumulation process. So they object to ISLM, you know, a real balance effect, the assumption that expectations are always fulfilled, you know, the rational expectations thing. Money has no real significance. They reject this because money is important and no such thing as full employment. Again, in the general theory, we have uncertainty. Expectations cannot be relied on, especially in the financial markets. Keynes says in the general theory something like this: when the capital accumulation of a country is left to a casino process, the job is being done in an ill-fashioned way, something like this. They're not doing right because, you know, they're very important in the capital accumulation process in the long run. And money and demand deficiency are also important problems. These are Keynesian ideas. Well, these are, with respect to the price theory, again, Kalecki have some classical elements and also some monopolistic or oligopolistic elements, which were also important in the post-Keynesian tradition in the beginning, in the 1950s, basically. Remember Mrs. Robinson's theory of monopolistic competition, was it? I guess so. And the endogenous money theory, again, these days, it's very fashionable. Well, the whole debate starts in the 1970s when the Bretton Woods system was collapsing. So especially Calder, Robinson, and Moore were important figures in this discussion. And so money is important. So instability of capitalism is due to investment, etc. So in general, as a general table, we can use this one. So in the classical tradition, the analysis is basically synchronic, sometimes diachronic, potentially dynamic, but not so much. And it's hitch-bound, so a kind of invisible backhand, or even sometimes evolutionary hand. Neoclassical, we have synchronic, sometimes diachronic, usually mostly hitchless and invisible hand. In different versions of Keynes, we have different conceptions of equilibrium. This can be understood, by the way. You know, Keynes is concerned with developing some policy alternatives. So if you want to devise an reliable economic policy, you have to assume maybe a kind of comparative framework. You know, you should think in terms of the increases or decreases in government expenditures, for example, or money supply, etc. So the effect of these changes in these policies may be traced only within a comparative static analysis, maybe. But if we are to understand the working of capitalism and competition and accumulation process, such a framework is not enough, obviously, so that we have a clash among or between two different visions within Keynes himself. In the Austrian schools, again, invisible hand conception, but competition is considered as a kind of dynamic process, but in the end, again, we are come up with the idea of invisible hand. So these are the basic conceptions associated with this, especially the last row. We have the sources of instability in the neoclassical economics. These sources are basically external, you know, government or state interventions, central bank actions, monopolistic or oligopolistic imperfect competition. And in the classical school, they're basically internal capital accumulation and price crisis. Marx is also aware of the importance of the financial system, but, you know, he did not work out properly in this direction. And Austrian economics, again, external, mostly the state, as in Hayek's, for example. And the Keynesian economics, we have internal problems. One is the working of the financial system, you know, rejection of the sales law because of the fact that money is not only a medium of exchange, but it's a financial asset. It's a form of wealth. It's the most liquid form of wealth. And also capital accumulation, especially growth analysis developed after Keynes by Harrod and Domar and other Cambridge Keynesians. These are, again, internal sources. In the Harrod-Domar model, maybe you can remember, we had this knife edge property. You know, an equilibrium can be reached, but whenever there's a divergence from equilibrium, you can never go back to the equilibrium position, which is quite important in understanding the unstable nature of capitalism, I would say. Again, Schumpeter is another thing, basically the idea of creative destruction. So once again, we have this idea. We have two different conceptions. One is the evolutionary one, other is the static or comparative static analysis. So these are radically different from each other, and in the history of economic theory, in general, we have both of these approaches, not necessarily in a technical way, but in terms of the notions or understanding about how capitalism works, especially classical Marxist and Schumpeterian, Adam Smith also included, notions of competition. Competition is dynamic, and in the long run, it has the tendency to create both equilibrium and disequilibrium, even crisis. That's the basic idea, or at best, business cycles, some internal fluctuations of the economic activity in general. So in the neoclassical or in the equilibrium understanding of Keynesians, ISL and Keynesians, we have again a kind of equilibrating forces that are emphasized mostly, and economic policy options is more important than a long-run framework that considers the capital accumulation process, basically. And as to the emergence of the order and its stability, the basic idea of invisible hand is employed by both neoclassical economics and some versions of Keynesian, again, ISL and Keynesian, or the grand neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, neoclassical synthesis for short. So basically, I think this classification is enough to understand differences with respect to the working of capitalism and the emergence of order and its stability and the long-run accumulation process whenever you look at the history of economic analysis in general, but that's another subject matter that we can talk about. What I mean is the topic of the history of economic analysis. Okay, for now, I think I have to stop here because I have no more to say, basically, and this is the end of the story of methods of economics. I have to stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. So I'm stopping now. See you guys later, hopefully. Take care.